Great to have you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank
Danke.
you. Stage is yours.
Thank you so much. Danke. That's about it for my German, so sorry, it's going to be in English. Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for having me. It's not too bad, right? It's not that hot. If everyone thinks cool, we can take it. I think my job today, as you heard, is to step pretty far back and give you a big picture. Why are companies spending so much time and energy talking about their environmental and social performance, or what many are calling ESG, which I still call sustainability because they're a little bit different. How did we get here? What's happening? But before I do that, I want to step pretty far back, because when we dive into sustainability, it's easy to get into the details very quickly. What's the carbon footprint? Do I have problems in my supply chain? What questions do I have to answer from the investors of the world? And forget why. Why are we doing this? So, anybody know this city? It's a US city. This is Los Angeles. Now, it's a little bit of a trick question because LA is known for being covered in smog, and people don't actually know there's mountains that close to it. And this was a particular day. I want you to remember a day that was not too long ago, where LA had, I think, the cleanest air ever in its existence. And there were pictures all over the world. Beijing, Sao Paulo, Milan, New Delhi. Now, you can imagine what day this was. When do you think this was? It's the second week of April of 2020. It's the cleanest day because everything had stopped. Now, I'm not suggesting that the way we get to a clean world is to stop the global economy, but this gave us a vision. In sustainability, we talk about the doom and gloom so much, and I will talk about some of the problems. But this is what the world is going to look like when we hit those net zero targets that so many companies have, that so many countries have. If we get to zero carbon emissions in 2050, it's going to be this healthy. When we're using renewable power, when we're driving electric vehicles, and maybe the people in these cities and the communities that support them, and the farms and mining communities, are all paid a living wage. This is the thriving future that we're trying to build. This is why I do the work that I do. And I think it's good to remember why you do sustainability. Now, we live in a time of unbelievable acceleration. It's what the US military has called a VUCA world. It's volatile, it's uncertain. It is complex, no doubt. And all of our issues are growing exponentially. Our population has grown exponentially, our use of material, water, waste, since the Industrial Revolution. But there's two, maybe three giant existential challenges that we have to solve in this next generation, and that business is being asked to solve. One is inequality. Now, there's always been rich and poor. No one says that that's necessarily the worst thing. It's part of capitalism. But what's happened in the last 40 years is that all of the wealth and income gains have gone to just the top 10%, and even really the top 1%, which now owns 37% of the wealth. This creates instability in society. People will vote for autocrats that tell them, I will make your life better, you've been left behind. This is why there's such a rise in anti-democracy. It's partly because people feel left behind. Second, of course, there's the climate crisis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. It is the existential challenge. I think of it as the final exam for humanity. Can we actually come together and solve this? It is threatening our well-being. Now, Swiss Re, one of the insurance companies that pays the bills when extreme weather comes, and by the way, is it not kind of appropriate that we had to shorten this meeting a little and try to move along because it's so hot? I mean, this is what's happening around the world. The extremes are coming more and more. Now, Swiss Re says that we could lose 18-20% of the global economy. And that is a lot, but it sounds livable, right? We've had recessions or depressions. But I remind people that that's an average. There are places, a few places, that will gain. Canada, northern Russia. They'll have longer growing seasons. But for most places, it's going to be worse. And it's not, in many places, going to be an 18% loss of the economy, but 100%, as places become unlivable, too hot to work in, or literally underwater. This is what's at stake. And increasingly for companies, having the kinds of goals that say we understand this and we're working on it is just table stakes. You have to be at that level and going beyond, and that's what we're going to talk about. Now, we've hit this point where the cost of doing nothing is way higher than the cost of action. I hear from people who want to go slower, well, if we tackle climate change, it'll destroy the economy, which is ludicrous. It makes no sense. The cost is so high. But it's also because the cost of doing something has gone down. And I get asked every day pretty much, I've been doing this for about 20 years, this overlap of business and society. I get asked, doesn't it always cost more? And it doesn't. It's a nuanced answer, it's a longer answer, but it doesn't always cost more. Lots of things in business cost. There's investments to be made. But sustainability doesn't inherently cost more, any more than any other investment in the business does. But it pays, partly because of this. It is now more costly to do nothing than do something at the societal level and at the company level. And so we're seeing exponential trends that are good. Not just the exponential increase in our problems, but exponential growth in companies buying renewable energy. This isn't utilities, this is companies buying their own. And why is this happening? It's not because of sustainability, really. It's not because they're answering questions from investors. It's because the cost of building renewable energy has dropped dramatically and exponentially. It is now cheaper in most of the world to build solar and wind. That's a direct quote from a Bloomberg article just a few months ago about the scale of how fast this is changing. So it pays. It pays to go to renewable energy. This is not a sacrifice. We're seeing exponential change in vehicles. Last year, the total sales of cars in the world dropped. But the sales of hybrids and electric went up exponentially. I just saw data on venture capital investing in the clean tech world, also up exponentially, up 89% from 21 to 22, in a world where VC investing was flat. And again, why is this happening in cars? The costs are down exponentially. The costs of doing this have dropped dramatically. So it's not just an opportunity. There's also increased pressure from companies on each other, from stakeholders. Companies are pushing their suppliers to do more. But there are forms of positive pressure. The Bank Santander is working with Tesco, the big European retailer, and they're offering Tesco suppliers, the ones who do well on ESG and environmental metrics, they're giving them lower cost of capital. They're making it cheaper to operate. That's a good pressure. Lots of companies are also penalizing their suppliers if they don't hit metrics. And we're facing a new view of the world as companies increasingly are talking about what's called Scope 3 emissions. For those who don't know, Scope 1 emissions are your carbon emissions on site if you're burning fuel. Scope 2 is from the grid, what you're buying from the grid and the electricity that's made. And Scope 3 is the big one. This is your suppliers and your customers. For many companies that I know and work with, especially in the consumer products, Scope 3 is 95% of their emissions. So you're seeing more and more attention. Starbucks, for example, did their life cycle impacts, and the biggest chunk was not actually the store energy, it wasn't the coffee, it was the milk, it was the dairy, 21% of their footprint. So they said we have to help consumers choose non-dairy options. This is the kind of work that's going on as we think about this in a different way. But there's two fundamental grand forces at work. People ask me if we might be hitting a recession. There's inflation. Will it slow down sustainability? Well, no. And I think because two things. One, there's just increased transparency. Many of you probably know what's called the clean label movement. People want to know what's in their products. Who made this? Were they paid a living wage? What's the carbon footprint? But now it's increasingly getting regulated. The Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, the EU with the Corporate Responsibility Directive, it's forcing companies to measure and report their emissions. And there's a recent law in Germany that's called the German Supply Chain Accountability and Transparency Act that I only show because it's one word, which is just my favorite thing about German. I honestly show this just because it makes me smile. I married into a German family, which makes it even worse that I speak so little. But I've heard people pronounce this, I'm sure you all can, or many of you can, but it's just to me very funny. It has to be one word. So on top of transparency, there's really the biggest change. Changes in society happen, really, when the norms change. when younger people change what they expect. And the change to millennials and Gen Z being the dominant force in the workforce is happening right now. How many people are 42, 41 and younger in the room? Not too many who will admit it. Usually put them in one little room. So I speak a lot to leadership teams and companies, and millennials are just getting there. And I've been talking about millennials as the young people in business for 15, 20 years. And I'm sorry, millennials, you're just not that young anymore. You're hitting 40, welcome to middle age. It means you have more and more power, but Gen Z is coming in now. Millennials have said for years that they want values in their work. They've chosen workplaces for that. Gen Z is at a different level. You heard a story from Gavin today about his 11-year-old. I have 2 Gen Z boys, and one of the things I love about Gen Z is they make fun of millennials. It kind of gives me joy because I'm Gen X. You always find the generations around you annoying. And the Gen Z people are very different. To say they're environmental enthusiasts is an understatement. They get this. The people in their 20s now, they see what's happening in the world. They care about this very deeply. So the question for business, if you want to just look at it from a business and financial perspective, is how are you going to attract and retain talent in this world when this is what people want? It certainly pays to be able to get the best people and keep them. I have now heard repeatedly certain sectors are having trouble. Fossil fuel companies having trouble getting the best engineers. People want to be working on the solutions. So what does this all mean? Well, what's changed in the last few years that's been dramatic, and more change in the last few than I've seen in 20, is what companies are expected to have a position on, to say publicly. In the US, there's a lot of debate going on, and companies aren't sure about how to speak about this with political battles. But by and large, your employees, your stakeholders expect you to have a stand on the big problems, on climate, on inequality and biodiversity, but also on race and gender equity, on LGBTQ plus rights, on democracy, on misinformation. You have to have something to say. And fundamentally, companies are being asked, who are you? Who do you serve? Is it just shareholders, or is it something more? And I believe that sustainability now is the role in society. It isn't just what's your footprint. It's a much bigger question. The other ramification from this is that the opportunity now is vast. Just the decarbonization effort of the world is changing multi-trillion-dollar markets. How we build things, how we manufacture, how we get around. Food and agriculture, enormous change coming and building. Consumer products, huge increase in speed of growth and more sustainable offerings. These are enormous markets. Now, what I've described, these trends, these are the real forces. This is the real change. It's not the political theater of what's called anti-ESG in the US. That's not really going to slow things down, because the reason companies are doing this is it's better for business, the climate change is real, stakeholders want it, they want to get employees, they have to be transparent. These are the things changing the world. And given the scale of our problems now, and climate change is a very dire problem, we have to go faster. We can't just decrease a little bit. And you heard this. You heard this from Samuel. You heard the scale of change that SIG is looking for. They are stepping up. We need business to step up, not to necessarily lead everything. It has to be done with government, with civil society, with consumers. And so part of this need to go faster is why I wrote this book with Paul Pullman, who ran Unilever for 10 years. He was widely respected as the most sustainable focused CEO in the world. Unilever often ranks at the top of these kinds of lists. Doesn't mean they're perfect, not at all. There are still major problems. And by the way, plastics is really one of their big issues, so getting out of that, getting less of that is a big solution. But we believe a net positive business is one that profits and grows. It definitely profits. You know, Paul was the CFO at Nestle for many years. He was the CEO of Unilever, so profit's important. But it does it by solving the world's problems, not making them worse, not creating them. And you heard in the intro, the question we ask is the world better off because your business is in it? I find that makes people stop for a minute. And I'm someone who turned 50 during the pandemic, and I found myself asking, is the world better off because I'm in it? It's a really Again, millennials, welcome. Welcome to the questioning era of being middle-aged and thinking, what is the reason for all this? Do we have something to say? Now, the principles of this kind of business that are a little different from just a normal profit-maximizing business are taking ownership for the full chain of your business, for the full impacts of everything you do, whether they're intended or not. It's about taking a long-term view that is tough. Short-term pressure is real from investors. It is about multi-stakeholder, thinking about all your stakeholders, serving them, and then getting value to the shareholders because you've solved a problem. That is what a business is about. It's solving a problem for a customer. And then there's a belief in partnering that's critical, transformative partnering, because these problems are big. Now, I want to expand on the ownership idea a little bit. So we have this model in the book that looks at, I mentioned those 3 scopes of carbon. And there are 3 categories of impact on the world. But there's more. There's bigger impact. You could go beyond just your supply chain and customers and think about the sector. That's part of why meetings like this are so important. This is how you get to circular discussions. You need a whole sector to work together. There's policy. Are you engaging in the policy? By the way, thank you for taking pictures, but I have to thank SIG actually has a book. I don't know if that's a surprise. There's a book for everyone, and a picture of this is in the book, so you will have it in print. Yay! Okay, that was a good applause. Thank you. And I actually ask that you consider actually reading it. I get books at events and things, but we really, I think, put a lot of work into it, and I think it will help. It will help you think bigger. And at the largest level, companies are needing to think about consumption, about their contribution to a fossil fuel-based society. So you can do this for carbon, but you can also do this for the social side. Let's take employees. Let's imagine a food business. So we care about employee safety, first and foremost. The next level out is their well-being. But you can expand your view. How healthy is the life of the food and farm workers, of their communities? Are we supporting the policies that bring about regenerative agriculture, that help build the kind of recycling system that reduce food waste? And at the largest level, how are we going to feed 9 or maybe 10 billion people? We hit 8 billion recently. I remember in grade school when we hit 5 billion. My father talks about 2 billion. So we're growing. How are we going to feed everyone within the thresholds? Now, that sounds like big stuff. You can sit there and say, I can't solve hunger. And you're not expected to. This is about figuring out what are the problems you can help solve and thinking in systems. Now, no company is net positive yet. They aren't. They can't be yet. But we're building, and companies have pieces of the story. IKEA, for example, generates more renewable energy than it needs, so it's positive directly on energy, but it's even going beyond that and now selling solar to customers. Yes, to sell solar and make money, but in part to reduce their footprint and have a positive impact. The other thing that's different about a net positive business is the leadership, the kind of leadership. One of the leaders that we admire is Ajay Banga. Now, he ran MasterCard for many years. He's now, if you know, the new head of the World Bank. He's talked for a long time about decency. Not just an intelligence quotient, but a decency quotient. Do you care about the people you work with, about the problems we're facing? Do you have the courage? It's really the core of this is courage to live your values, to have purpose in your work, in your business, to have empathy, to have humanity. And you need humility because we need to be working with others, and that means asking questions that are hard. That means saying to NGOs who might be critical, hey, we actually need some of your knowledge. We don't know how to solve this problem alone. You have to have the courage to do that, and everyone can be a leader. This isn't just CEOs. Everyone in this room is a leader. You have an incredible opportunity to move the needle at your organizations and in your lives. So you have the book, so I don't have to spend a lot of time on this, but I'll give you a few examples. That part of the inner battle internally is changing how we think about investments, thinking about them more as investments, not just expense when it comes to sustainability. It's about kind of blowing up the boundaries. So even when we're setting a goal, say, for net zero waste in your factory, we're setting that goal not just because it's good for the business, but it's also recognizing there's a waste problem. It's taking in the outside world. That's how you start to build the thinking so you can go out to the rest of the world and have the partnerships you need. There are companies with systemic sets of goals. Mars has sustainable in a generation. Mars has always been aggressive on these kinds of goals for being net positive. The companies that are setting net positive goals are going faster. Microsoft says they will sequester all of the carbon in the atmosphere that they've emitted since they were founded. It's a retroactive neutrality, and I had never seen that until a couple years ago. Google also, similar goal, but they also have one that they want to power themselves entirely with green electrons. Now, that is not physically possible today. That's why you can't be net positive. The grid is not there. But what they've said is, okay, we're going to have a lot more on-site, we're going to have a lot more storage, and then we're going to work with communities and the grid to bring the grid to zero. So they've started investing in community solar and other things. One of the companies, the rare companies that has a systemic view of positive is SIG. SIG was using the phrase net positive a few years before the book came out. We didn't create the phrase. And they have what's an incredibly aggressive set of goals. You heard some of it today, just for what a package should do. But also things like, this is really unusual. I've worked on companies for 20 years. Things like what's in that package, taking responsibility for the nutrition of that is a net positive way of acting, and it is incredibly unusual. Companies are setting goals not just on carbon and their direct footprint, but how can they help with nature. Walmart, which is the largest company by revenue in human history, says they want to be regenerative. That's basically net positive. It's the same idea. They're going to save 50 million acres of land, 1 million square miles of ocean. Kering, the big apparel company, also wants to be net positive on biodiversity, offsetting all the cotton and the land that they use in their products. Now, what's core about this is partnerships. The consumer products world has come together in a lot of different ways. They've done things like harmonize pallets, so they're the same size. I learned in writing this book that there are 10 billion pallets, more than one for each of us. And by making them the same size in an industry, you save money. You save space. That's a kind of basic idea. There are quick wins here. Companies are coming together to experiment with packaging, with delivery methods. No one knows how these will all work, but we have to try new things to try to reduce the total impact. One of the partnerships I learned about in getting ready for this was SIG with WWF. Working with NGOs in a productive way is one of the things companies can do. And doing this with local businesses, with the World Wildlife Fund and SIG together, this is the kind of partnership that we need. Again, it takes openness. It takes courage to say to an NGO, you have a different view. It's not wrong. We tend to be in our own world and say, well, governments never understand business and NGOs think we're all bad. And then the government says business doesn't care. There's these views that I think we have to throw out and come into these partnerships open and realize this is another person around the table doing what they think is best. We can work together. And the solution to the biggest problems is when you get everyone together. Now, palm oil is one of the toughest challenges in the world. It's in so many of the products that we put on our bodies, that we eat. And it has been a source of emissions. It is the reason Indonesia is the 4th largest emitter in the world, bigger than a bunch of countries with larger economies. It's because farmers cut down land to grow more palm oil for all of us. Now, the big buyers like Unilever, Procter & Gamble, and others have been trying to solve this for years and failing, completely failing. So what happened in the last kind of 5 years was the deforestation rate in Indonesia actually started to drop, first time. And the reason is that they got everyone together for the first time. It wasn't just they sent demands back to farmers saying, be more sustainable. They brought the farmers, the municipalities, the government. They brought World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace in. They had ideas on how to do this better, how to double the yields per hectare. And then the final piece was money. The Sovereign Fund of Norway and some of the businesses put money in so these farmers could transition to better ways. And this has been working. It's this kind of hard work where you get everyone together. This is how you get to a healthy forest. So the animals are healthy and the people are healthy, doing business in the forest. So I ask you, what are your shared hurdles? When people say, oh, sustainability costs more, I usually say, well, what costs more? Is the technology not there, or is it, but it's maybe not cheap enough yet? You need to get to scale. What can you do together? The bottom line is that business cannot thrive. It's not going to keep profiting unless people and planet are thriving as well. So I ask you to consider, how are you going to be net positive? Please think about it as you go through the rest of this incredible event and go home. Go home to your businesses, to your families. How will you be net positive? Because the way we all answer that will absolutely save the world. Thank you so much.